Imagine a man who seemed like everything you could ever respect in a teacher. A decorated historian, honored by France with the Order of the Legion of Honor. A charismatic lecturer who made his students believe they were stepping into the age of Napoleon itself. But behind the walls of his Saint Petersburg apartment, this respected professor hid a darkness that no one could imagine. This is the story of Oleg Sokolov, a man who lived as Napoleon, and whose obsession and rage would end in one of Russia's most shocking crimes. Oleg Sokolov wasn't just a random academic. He was internationally known. Born in 1956, he studied history, specializing in the Napoleonic era. His passion wasn't just intellectual. He staged massive battle reenactments. He wrote books. He gave lectures that students described as like theater. He didn't just teach history, he performed it. For many people, Sokolov was larger than life. He dressed in Napoleonic uniforms, carried himself like a general, and even fought for recognition abroad. The French government itself awarded him one of its highest honors, making him look untouchable. But colleagues and students whispered about a different side of the professor. There were rumors of temper tantrums, of bursts of aggression. Some female students spoke quietly about his controlling nature. Still, his prestige and charisma made people look the other way. To most, Oleg Sokolov was a genius, eccentric, not a danger. In 2015, a new student entered his life, Anastasia Yeshchenko. She was young, bright, and just as passionate about history. Anastasia came from Krasnodar, where she had been an excellent student. When she moved to Saint Petersburg for graduate studies, she was drawn to Sokolov's lectures. She was ambitious, talented, and her professors saw her as one of the most promising students. For Sokolov, she was more than just another academic. She was intelligent, beautiful, and admired him deeply. Their relationship quickly crossed the boundary of student and teacher. To outsiders, it looked unusual. A professor in his 60s dating a student in her early 20s. But in academic circles, gossip is common, and many assumed it was just another eccentricity of the famous historian. What no one realized was how toxic, controlling, and dangerous this relationship would become. At first, Anastasia and Oleg appeared close. She often accompanied him at historical reenactments. She helped with his work, and she even moved in with him. They seemed like an odd but functioning couple. But soon the cracks began to show. Oleg was intensely jealous. Friends of Anastasia later described him as constantly monitoring her, questioning her, and wanting complete control. He hated when she spoke to other men, even casually. He would check her phone, demand explanations for her every action. For Anastasia, it became suffocating. She was still young. She wanted independence, but Oleg's possessiveness kept tightening around her. When arguments erupted, they were explosive. Neighbors would later recall hearing shouting and loud noises from the apartment. Some students claimed they saw bruises on her body, though she rarely spoke about it openly. Still, she stayed. Whether it was fear, manipulation, or a hope that things would get better, Anastasia continued living with the man who would one day take her life. By 2018, friends noticed that Anastasia was changing.
She became more withdrawn, less open, more careful in what she said. She confided to a few people that Oleg was unstable and violent, but she never pressed charges. In Russia, domestic violence cases are notoriously difficult to prove, and Oleg's position as a respected professor only made things harder. She tried to leave him several times. Each time, Oleg would beg, threaten, or manipulate her into coming back. He told her she was the most important part of his life. Without her, he claimed, he would collapse. But Anastasia was starting to see him clearly. He wasn't just jealous, he was dangerous. The arguments grew darker. Oleg's obsession with control deepened. In late 2019, things spiraled out of control. Anastasia was 24. She wanted freedom, a life outside the suffocating grasp of her 36-year-old partner. Oleg, terrified of losing her, clung to her even tighter. The couple argued constantly. Friends later said Anastasia told them she couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to leave him for good. But Oleg refused to accept it. He believed he owned her. But Anastasia was starting to see him clearly. He wasn't just jealous, he was dangerous. The arguments grew darker. Oleg's obsession with control deepened. In late 2019, things spiraled out of control. Anastasia was 24. She wanted freedom, a life outside the suffocating grasp of her 36-year-old partner. Oleg, terrified of losing her, clung to her even tighter. The couple argued constantly. Friends later said Anastasia told them she couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to leave him for good. But Oleg refused to accept it. He believed he owned her. At least that is what he would claim later in court. By the beginning of November, the tension inside their apartment had reached a breaking point. Neighbors heard shouting late into the night. Friends stopped hearing from Anastasia as often. It was clear that something was going to happen. No one knew how horrific it would be. What happened next shocked not only Saint Petersburg, but the entire world. A professor who once lectured about honor, history, and glory would soon be discovered in the cold waters of the Moika River, holding a backpack filled with the severed arms of the woman he claimed to love. But how did it come to this? And why did no one stop him, even when the warning signs were everywhere?
On the night of November 7th, 2019, the tension between Oleg Sokolov and Anastasia Yeshchenko finally erupted. They argued violently inside their Saint Petersburg apartment. According to investigators, Anastasia was determined to end the relationship. She wanted to leave, to reclaim her independence. But Sokolov, obsessed with control, could not accept it. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting, crashes, and what sounded like a violent struggle. At some point during the fight, Sokolov grabbed a shotgun that he kept in the apartment. In a fit of rage, he shot Anastasia 4 times. She was only 24 years old. In that moment, the mask of the respected professor finally shattered. Sokolov stood over the body of his student, his lover, and his victim. The man who had spent decades reenacting Napoleonic battles had now committed a crime that was brutally real. What happened next turned the tragedy into a horror story. Instead of calling the police or confessing, Sokolov decided to cover up his crime.
For 2 days, he lived in the apartment with Anastasia's body. Then, with chilling precision, he began to dismember her using a saw and knives. Investigators later described the apartment as a nightmare scene. Bloodstains, plastic bags, and tools scattered around. Sokolov stuffed body parts into trash bags and backpacks, planning to dispose of them quietly. His goal, as he later admitted, was to stage the disappearance and continue his life as if nothing had happened. But his plan quickly began to fall apart. On the morning of November 9th, passers-by near the Moika River noticed something strange. A man was struggling to stay afloat in the icy water. When rescuers pulled him out, they realized the man was none other than Professor Oleg Sokolov, and strapped to his body was a backpack. Inside the backpack were Anastasia's severed arms, along with a gun. The horror became undeniable. The image of the respected professor, dripping wet and clinging to a bag of human remains, shocked even the most hardened police officers. Sokolov was immediately arrested. The rest of Anastasia's remains were soon discovered in his apartment. The evidence was overwhelming. At first, Sokolov tried to rationalize his actions. He admitted to the killing, but claimed it was not premeditated. According to him, Anastasia had driven him to madness with her words, insulting his children and belittling him. He painted himself as the victim of a cruel argument. But investigators and the public were not convinced. The level of violence, the dismemberment, the attempt to dispose of the body, it all pointed to cold calculation. Forensic evidence showed that Anastasia was shot in cold blood, and Sokolov had time to think before deciding to cut up her body. During interrogations, Sokolov broke down in tears. He said he had planned to disguise himself as Napoleon during Anastasia's funeral, staging a dramatic suicide dressed in full uniform. The fantasy revealed just how deeply his obsession with history had merged with his distorted reality. The trial of Oleg Sokolov began in 2020. The courtroom was filled with journalists, former students, and Anastasia's grieving family. The details of the crime horrified the nation. Prosecutors argued that Sokolov was a manipulative, violent man who had a long history of abuse. Several women came forward, saying that he had attacked them in the past, but faced no real consequences because of his academic status. One former student even described how he had once beaten her and threatened her life years earlier. Yet the university had ignored her complaints. The trial revealed a chilling truth. Sokolov's violent tendencies had been an open secret for decades, but his reputation and connections protected him. Anastasia, tragically, became the victim that finally exposed him. In December 2020, the court found Sokolov guilty of murder and the illegal possession of firearms. He was sentenced to 12 years and 6 months in a high-security prison. For many, the punishment felt too light for such a brutal crime, but it was the maximum possible sentence under the charges. The murder sent shockwaves far beyond Saint Petersburg. In Russia, it reignited debates about domestic violence, which remains a deeply under-addressed issue in the country. Activists pointed to Anastasia's case as proof that the system fails to protect women, even when warning signs are obvious. At Saint Petersburg State University, where both Sokolov and Anastasia studied and worked, students protested. They demanded answers about why complaints against Sokolov had been ignored for years. How could a man with a documented history of aggression be allowed to continue teaching and mentoring young women? The scandal damaged the university's reputation and exposed a culture of silence around abuse. Internationally, the case was covered by major outlets. The contrast between Sokolov's prestigious image and the gruesome crime made headlines worldwide. It was the story of a prestigious academic who turned out to be a killer, a reminder that monsters can hide behind masks of authority and brilliance. Lost in the media frenzy was the memory of Anastasia herself. She was not just a victim. She was a talented, promising young historian with a bright future. Friends described her as kind, intelligent, and dedicated. She had dreams of building her own career in academia, of contributing to Russian history, of living a full life. Her life was cut short by the very man who claimed to love her, and her story became a symbol, not of Sokolov's madness, but of the systemic failures that allowed him to thrive unchecked. The Saint Petersburg dismemberment case remains one of the most shocking crimes in modern Russian history. It was not just the brutality of the act that horrified people, but the identity of the killer, a man admired, respected, and even celebrated. It exposed how prestige can shield abusers, how warning signs can be ignored, and how power can silence victims until it is too late. For Russia, it was a wake-up call. For the world, it was a chilling reminder that evil does not always look like a monster in the shadows. Sometimes it looks like a professor in a uniform, lecturing about the glory of history.